Hey there, deep divers. Welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure.
Today, we're tackling a question
Oh, yeah.
that's been around forever,
Uh-huh.
but feels super relevant right now.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Who decides what's true?
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is. And to help us unpack it, we've got a whole stack of legal documents
Okay.
about combating misinformation
Right.
and disinformation online.
Makes sense. That's a hot topic these days.
And you guessed it,
What's that?
things get complicated quickly.
I bet they do. All right, so where are we starting with this deep dive?
Well, we're going to see how Australia
All
is
right.
giving
Thank government.
an agency, the ACMA,
Okay, the Australian Communications and Media Authority.
that's the one. They're giving that agency a lot of power to deal with this whole misinformation thing.
Interesting.
We're also going to look at the system of,
The system?
the system of industry codes and government standards
Okay.
that are being created to address misinformation and disinformation.
Uh-huh. And what about them?
Well, it leaves us with a big question.
Lay it on me.
Who's writing those rules?
Yeah, good point. Who gets to decide what goes into those codes and standards?
And then there are these exemptions.
Exemptions, what do you mean?
Exemptions to the rules.
Like loopholes.
Kind of. We'll find out who gets a free pass and why.
Oh, this is getting juicy. I'm ready to dive in.
And, of course,
Yeah.
we have to talk about censorship.
Right, because anytime you talk about controlling information,
It always sparks debate about freedom of expression.
absolutely. So we've got a lot to unpack here.
We do. Luckily, we've got our amazing expert speaker here
Happy to be here.
to help us navigate these legal documents. They can cut through the jargon
I try.
and make sense of it all for us.
That's the goal.
So let's dive in.
Okay, sounds good. Where do we start?
Well, first up, we've got, this is a bill.
A bill.
Yeah. Amending Australia's Broadcasting Services Act to combat misinformation and disinformation online.
So this is where the rubber meets the road, huh?
It is.
All right, I'm ready. What's the big picture here? What's this law all about?
Well, it outlines some very specific types of harm that it's trying to prevent.
Right, like what?
Well, one of the biggest ones
Yeah.
is harm to the electoral process.
Oh, that's a big one. Election integrity is crucial.
Exactly. Nobody wants to see elections swayed
Swayed by.
by fake news and misleading information.
You're right. That undermines the whole system.
How can we trust the democratic process if we
Yeah.
can't even agree on what's true?
Exactly. Truth is the foundation of a functioning democracy.
Right. And then there's harm to public health.
Okay, yeah. Misinformation about health can be really dangerous.
For sure. Like, think about those bogus medical claims.
Oh, I know what you mean, like miracle cures and stuff.
Exactly. It's scary how easily people can be misled.
It really is. People are vulnerable, especially when it comes to their health.
So this law is trying to address that.
Makes sense. What else?
It also wants to prevent the vilification of groups.
Okay, that's important. Protecting vulnerable groups from hate speech.
Exactly. And then it covers things like inciting violence.
Oh, wow. Okay. So stuff that could actually lead to physical harm,
Uh-huh. And damaging critical infrastructure.
like power grids and communication networks.
Right. Or hurting the Australian economy.
Wow, that's a pretty broad scope. So this law is trying to cover a lot of ground.
It is. So the question is, how does the ACMA actually enforce all this?
Yeah, how do they actually stop the spread of misinformation?
Right. Are they like internet police?
Constantly patrolling the web. Well, not exactly patrolling.
But they've got some serious power, right?
They do. They can request digital platforms to be transparent.
Transparent.
Yeah, about what they're doing to combat misinformation.
Okay, so they have to show their work, so to speak.
Right, no hiding allowed. They can also compel these platforms to hand over information
Directly to them.
directly to the ACMA.
So they're not messing around.
Nope. And if the ACMA finds a platform isn't doing enough,
Uh-oh. What happens then?
they can issue formal warnings
Oh, okay. So like a slap on the wrist?
or even remedial directions, which are basically orders to clean up their act.
So what happens if they just ignore those warnings?
Then things can get serious. The ACMA can go to court to get injunctions or impose some pretty hefty fines.
Wow, so there's some real teeth to this legislation.
Yeah, they're not afraid to use their power.
Which brings us back to our original question.
And that is,
Who gets to decide what's true?
right, because even with these definitions,
Of misinformation and disinformation.
yeah, even with those, it's not always clear cut, is it?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, what one person considers a credible source could be completely different for someone else.
You're absolutely right. And what about serious harm?
Yeah, what constitutes serious harm? That seems pretty subjective, too.
Totally. What one person considers a serious threat.
Might be nothing to someone else.
Exactly. So it's like,
Yeah.
who gets to be the ultimate judge of truth?
And what happens to the people who disagree?
Yeah, what about dissenting voices? It's a tricky situation for sure.
It feels like we're walking a tightrope here.
I agree. And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Oh, tell me more.
This law doesn't apply to everyone equally.
What do you mean?
There are some exemptions.
Exemptions, like who?
Well, first off, email services are completely excluded.
Really? So if someone's spreading misinformation through their personal email.
ACMA can't touch them.
Wow. Okay. So it's more about the platforms where things can go viral.
Yeah, it seems like they're focusing on where content can have a broader impact.
Makes sense. Where things can escalate quickly.
Exactly. Another exemption is media sharing services
Okay.
that don't have interactive features.
So like sites where you just share pictures?
Right. Without much opportunity for commenting or back and forth.
So they're targeting platforms that are designed for discussion.
It seems that way, where misinformation can spread more easily.
Okay, that makes sense.
But here's the kicker.
What's that?
The minister actually has the power.
The power to.
The power to determine other excluded services.
Wait, so there's like this element of discretion involved?
It seems that way. They can add to that exemption list whenever they want.
Wow. That seems like it could be open to abuse. Who decides what's worthy of an exemption?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Who gets to make those decisions? And based on what criteria?
Exactly. And it brings us to probably the most controversial exemption.
Oh, which is?
Professional news content.
Hold on. So even if a professional news outlet
Publishes something false or misleading.
they're exempt.
They're exempt
But don't we see examples of that all the time?
all the time. Misinformation slipping through the cracks of professional news.
So how does that work? How can they be exempt if they're spreading false information?
Well, the bill argues that these professional news providers
Yeah.
are already held to a certain standard
Okay.
because they have to adhere to journalistic codes of practice
So the assumption is that they have safeguards in place.
against publishing false information.
Okay. So they're considered more trustworthy in a way.
Right. And they also have to demonstrate editorial independence,
Meaning?
that they're not being unduly influenced by the people or organizations they're covering.
So they're supposed to be impartial and objective.
Exactly. But it still feels like there's potential for bias, right?
Of course.
Hmm.
I mean, who decides which outlets are professional enough?
And couldn't this be used to silence alternative media voices?
Yeah, the ones that challenge the mainstream narrative.
It's complicated. This
Yeah.
whole thing about trying to regulate truth.
It really is. You're dealing with power, control, who gets to shape the information landscape.
And it gets even trickier when you start thinking about global implications.
Oh, right. How do these Australian laws affect platforms based in other countries?
That's a great question. That's what we're going to explore next. Okay, so we've got these Australian laws
Yeah,
aimed at combating misinformation.
right.
But how do they affect platforms?
Platforms.
Yeah, like social media platforms
Mhm.
that are based in other countries.
That's a great question.
Can Australia really police the entire internet?
Well, it's tricky,
Yeah.
but the legislation specifically targets platforms
Okay.
with Australian end users.
So it doesn't matter where the company is based.
It doesn't.
If Australians are using it,
Uh-huh.
they have to comply with Australian rules.
Exactly.
Wow. So even if a company is operating,
Yeah,
like out of Silicon Valley or something,
right,
if Australians are on their platform,
right.
they still have to play by Australia's rules.
They do. It's kind of like a
What?
digital visitor's visa.
A digital visitor's visa.
Yeah, yeah. If you want to operate in Australia's online space,
You gotta play by
the rules. Otherwise, you face the penalties.
Oh, right, like the
Fines, injunctions, all that.
the whole shebang.
Yep.
That's a bold move.
Yeah.
But doesn't that create a whole other set of challenges?
Like what?
Well, like, what if another country
Uh-huh.
has different rules
Oh,
about what they consider misinformation?
right.
Couldn't that lead to conflict,
Oh, absolutely.
like a global tug of war over online content?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. We're already seeing countries around the world taking different approaches to this.
I can imagine.
Some governments are much more hands-off,
Why?
while others are implementing much stricter regulations.
So how is a platform supposed to keep up with all that?
Yeah, imagine trying to comply with all these
Yeah.
conflicting laws from different countries.
Talk about a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder if this could lead to a fragmented internet.
A fragmented internet.
Yeah, like different countries have different versions of truth.
Depending on where you're accessing the information.
Exactly.
It's a concern. People are calling it the splinternet.
The splinternet.
Yeah, so instead of a single unified internet,
Right.
we end up with a patchwork of online spaces, each with its own set of rules.
In its own version of truth.
Potentially, yeah.
It sounds kind of dystopian.
Yeah.
Like something out of a sci-fi novel.
It does a bit, doesn't it?
Because it undermines the whole idea of the internet
Uh-huh.
as this platform for open communication.
The free exchange of ideas.
Exactly. So how do these platforms deal with that?
I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on them to navigate this complex geopolitical landscape.
I bet. Trying to appease all these different governments.
With very different ideas about censorship.
Yeah. It's a tightrope walk for sure.
It really is.
So it seems like this whole effort to combat misinformation is opening up this Pandora's box of ethical and logistical challenges.
It is. And it all circles back to that fundamental question.
Which is,
who decides what's true?
right, and who decides who gets to decide?
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about the content itself.
It's about
who has the power to control it.
Okay, so we've talked about how these Australian laws might be used to control what foreign platforms can say
To Australians.
to Australians, right?
Yeah.
But what about
Right.
free speech within Australia itself?
Ah, good point.
How do these laws impact
Yeah.
the right of Australians to express themselves freely online?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated.
I figured.
Remember how we talked about Australia not having a specific Bill of Rights?
Right, it's kind of a patchwork system when it comes to free speech.
Yeah, exactly. So let's take a look at this document. This dives into the legal framework
Surrounding.
surrounding free speech in Australia.
So what does this tell us?
Well, freedom of speech isn't explicitly spelled out in the Australian Constitution.
So how is it protected?
It relies on a combination of things.
Like,
Common law,
okay,
the principle of legality.
the principle of legality.
Yeah.
What's that?
Well, it essentially means that courts will assume that Parliament didn't intend to interfere with a fundamental right.
Like free speech.
Exactly. Unless it's very clearly stated in the law.
So it's like an unspoken agreement.
Kind of, yeah. The government can't limit your right to express yourself unless they put it in writing.
in very specific terms.
Exactly. So there's this kind of presumption in favor of free speech.
Unless the law explicitly says otherwise.
Right. But then you have this other concept,
Which is
implied freedom of political communication.
implied freedom of political communication.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Well, the Australian High Court has recognized
Recognize what?
that freedom of political communication is essential for a healthy democracy,
Okay.
even though it's not directly mentioned in the Constitution.
So it's like this unspoken but essential right.
Precisely.
But wait, if it's not written down,
Yeah.
how do we know what it covers?
That's the thing. Defining the boundaries of that implied freedom
Huh?
has been a huge source of debate.
How far does it extend?
Yeah, exactly. And when does it bump up against other rights?
And I guess the big question for us is,
Yeah.
how do these new laws about misinformation fit into all of this?
Right. Because on one hand,
Yeah.
you have the desire to protect people from harm.
From
Physical harm, emotional harm to society.
But on the other hand,
You have the right to express yourself freely,
even if your views are unpopular.
even if they're controversial. Yeah.
So where do you draw the line?
That's the million-dollar question. The courts have been trying to find that balance for years.
And these new laws are just adding another layer of complexity.
Yeah. They are. Because it's clear the government is taking this seriously.
They're giving the ACMA a lot of power to regulate online content.
But they also know
You know what?
that those powers could be misused,
Or have unintended consequences.
especially when it comes to free speech.
So it's a delicate balancing act for sure.
It really is.
And it kind of makes me wonder,
Wonder what?
how effective can these laws really be?
In combating misinformation, you mean?
Yeah. Are they just a Band-Aid solution to a much bigger problem?
That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, it's not just about stopping the spread of false information.
It's about navigating these ethical and legal landmines.
Exactly. When you try to control what people can say and think,
It feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
we are. And it's important to remember
To remember what?
That this isn't just an Australian problem.
It's global.
It is. It's a global challenge we all need to be thinking about.
Okay, deep divers, time to come up for air for a minute and think about everything we've learned from these documents. Feels like we've uncovered more questions than answers.
It's true. But isn't that what makes these deep dives so interesting?
Yeah, I think so. It's all about challenging what we think we know and, well, getting comfortable with the gray areas.
Exactly. There's rarely a clear-cut answer when you're dealing with something as complex as truth and misinformation.
So where do we even start? We began with this question of who gets to decide what's true.
Right. A seemingly simple question.
But it's anything but simple.
Oh, not at all.
We've seen how Australia is trying to combat misinformation.
With these new laws, yeah.
Giving the ACMA all this power.
To regulate online content, yep.
And they're targeting very specific harms, like we talked about.
Election interference, threats to public health.
Right, even potential damage to the economy.
All very serious stuff.
But defining what actually is misinformation and disinformation.
That's where it gets tricky.
It's not black and white.
Not at all.
There's so much subjectivity involved.
Absolutely.
What one person sees as, just like a harmless opinion.
Right.
Someone else might see as a dangerous lie.
Exactly. And that raises all those concerns about censorship and bias.
It really does.
Yeah.
Like, who gets to hold the keys to the truth kingdom?
That's the million-dollar question. And who gets to decide who makes those decisions?
Right. And let's not forget those exemptions we talked about.
Oh, yeah, those were interesting.
Certain groups, certain types of content, they're shielded from these regulations.
Email services, certain media sharing platforms.
And professional news outlets.
Right.
Makes you wonder.
It does.
Who benefits from those exemptions and who gets left out?
Exactly. And could it be used to silence certain voices?
And then there's that whole global dimension.
And a whole other can of worms.
Australia's laws could have this ripple effect.
Across the world.
Across the world, leading to a fragmented internet.
Where every country has its own version of the truth.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
So how do we even begin to balance this?
Balance what?
The need to protect people from harm, but also protect free speech.
It's such a classic dilemma, isn't it?
It really is. How do we prevent censorship while also ensuring people have access to accurate information?
That's the challenge. I don't think there's an easy answer.
It's like we're walking a tightrope here.
Yeah. And the stakes are high.
But these documents, I think they highlight something important. The importance of critical thinking.
Being able to evaluate information for yourself.
Exactly. And media literacy.
Understanding how media works, its biases, its limitations.
We can't just blindly accept everything we see online.
Even if it comes from a source that seems credible.
Right. We have to be skeptical, ask questions.
Consider different perspectives.
It's about being informed and engaged citizens.
Exactly. Not passive consumers of information.
And I think it's also important to acknowledge that truth.
Yeah.
It's often elusive. It can be subjective.
And it can change over time, too.
Exactly. What's considered true today might be debunked tomorrow.
We need to be open to new information.
To adapting our understanding as we learn more.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this.
Yeah.
The question of who decides what's true is more important than ever. It's not just some abstract debate.
It has real consequences.
That affects all of us.
Oh, okay.
So stay curious, stay critical, and keep asking those tough questions.
Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo and seek out diverse perspectives.
Because the journey to truth is never truly over.
It's a process of continuous exploration and reevaluation.
Until next time, happy deep diving.